On the evening of January 13th, 1978, at approximately 8:30 p.m., a middle-aged Soviet engineer named Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev placed a handwritten envelope in the mailbox of a residential building near the American Embassy compound in central Moscow. The temperature that day had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius, typical for a Moscow winter, and the streets were covered in packed snow that had been accumulating since early December. The envelope was addressed to an American diplomat whose identity remains classified in declassified CIA records, but who Tolkachev believed to be a case officer working under diplomatic cover at the American embassy. Tolkachev had obtained through his position at a classified military research facility a schedule of American diplomats assigned to various functions at the embassy, and he had used this information to identify a potential intelligence officer. What that diplomat would discover the following evening when he returned home from work was an envelope containing a 3-page handwritten letter in Russian and several pages of technical documents that would mark the beginning of one of the most valuable intelligence operations the United States conducted during the entire Cold War period. The information this Soviet engineer would provide over the following 7 years would give American military planners detailed technical specifications of Soviet radar systems, air defense networks, and aviation research programs worth, according to later CIA assessments, billions of dollars in research and development costs. The man's name was Adolf Tolkachev. He was 50 years old. He worked as a senior electronics engineer at a classified military research facility in Moscow called the Phazotron Design Bureau. And he was desperate to betray his country. Before we continue with Adolf Tolkachev's story, if you're interested in the hidden human cost of Cold War espionage and the real stories behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these documented cases every week, exploring the moral complexity behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's continue with how this desperate Soviet engineer finally made contact with American intelligence. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev had been born in 1927 in Aktobe, a city in what was then the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, to a family that had experienced significant upheaval during the early decades of Soviet power. His father, Georgy Tolkachev, had worked as an accountant before the revolution and had managed to maintain employment in the Soviet bureaucracy during the 1920s and 1930s, despite being classified as part of the former bourgeois class. His mother, Olga, had been a schoolteacher. According to declassified CIA files containing biographical information Tolkachev himself provided during his years of cooperation, his childhood had been marked by material hardship and by a pervasive atmosphere of fear that characterized Soviet society during the Stalin era. Tolkachev demonstrated exceptional aptitude in mathematics and physics during his secondary education. In 1945, at age 18, he was admitted to the Moscow Aviation Institute, one of the Soviet Union's premier technical universities, where he studied electronics and radar systems. He graduated in 1950 with high marks and was immediately recruited into the Soviet military-industrial complex, assigned to a research institute designated in Soviet bureaucratic terminology as Scientific Research Institute No. 5, or NII-5, though its actual designation in classified documents was the Phazotron Design Bureau. This facility, located in northern Moscow, specialized in the development of radar systems for military aviation. The work Tolkachev performed at Phazotron was highly classified. Colleagues would later describe him as meticulous, often staying late to triple-check calculations. He brought homemade lunch in a battered metal tin, black bread and cheese his wife prepared each morning. The facility developed look-down/shoot-down radar systems for Soviet fighter aircraft, early warning radar for strategic defense, and signal processing technologies that would allow Soviet air defense networks to detect and track low-flying aircraft and cruise missiles. Access to this work required the highest levels of security clearance. Tolkachev underwent extensive background investigations, repeated security reviews, and was subject to the continuous surveillance and monitoring that characterized life for anyone working in the Soviet defense sector. By all outward appearances, he was a model Soviet engineer, diligent, technically skilled, politically reliable. In 1953, Tolkachev married a woman named Natasha Kuzmina, who worked as a translator in Moscow. They had one son, Oleg, born in 1956. The family lived in a two-room apartment in a standard Soviet housing block in the Sokol district of northern Moscow. According to neighbors interviewed years later by Soviet security services, the Tolkachevs appeared to be a typical professional family. Adolf was described as quiet, somewhat reserved, focused on his work. Natasha was more sociable and maintained friendships with other women in the building. Oleg was an academically successful student who eventually attended university to study engineering like his father. What neighbors, colleagues, and even his own family did not know was that by the mid-1960s, Adolf Tolkachev had developed a profound antipathy toward the Soviet system and had begun to consider the possibility of making contact with Western intelligence services. According to statements Tolkachev made to CIA handlers years later, his motivations were both ideological and personal. Ideologically, he had come to view the Soviet government as fundamentally oppressive, corrupt, and built on a foundation of violence and deception. This perspective had been shaped in part by his family's experiences during the Stalin era and by his own observations of how the Soviet system functioned. Personally, he had been affected by the treatment of Natasha's family. Natasha's father had been arrested during one of Stalin's purges in the late 1930s and had died in a labor camp. This fact, though carefully concealed and never discussed openly, created what Tolkachev described as a permanent sense of anger and injustice that he carried throughout his adult life. He wanted to damage what he viewed as an evil system. He wanted revenge for what had been done to his wife's family. He wanted to believe that his life had meaning beyond contributing to Soviet military power, and he wanted to accumulate enough money, paid by Western intelligence, to ensure that his son could eventually leave the Soviet Union and build a life elsewhere. For more than a decade, Tolkachev considered how he might make contact with American or Western intelligence, but took no action. The risks were enormous. Soviet security services maintained pervasive surveillance of foreigners in Moscow, particularly diplomats from Western countries who were presumed to include intelligence officers. Any Soviet citizen observed making unauthorized contact with foreigners faced immediate investigation, arrest, and prosecution. The penalty for espionage was death by execution. Moreover, Tolkachev's position gave him access to extremely sensitive military technology, which meant he would be subject to particularly intensive scrutiny if he came under suspicion. Between late 1977 and early 1978, Adolf Tolkachev made multiple attempts to make contact with American diplomats in Moscow. The approaches followed a pattern. Tolkachev would identify American diplomatic vehicles or personnel, approach with a handwritten note or envelope, and attempt to initiate contact. Each time, the Americans declined, following standard counter-provocation procedures. Intelligence professionals call this defensive technique a cold approach rejection. CIA officers assessing these reports classified them as likely KGB operations designed to identify and compromise American intelligence officers. The CIA's caution was understandable. The KGB regularly staged false recruitment approaches to test American responses and identify case officers. Accepting materials from unknown Soviet citizens on Moscow streets violated established security protocols. What the CIA failed to recognize was that an authentic volunteer, one with access to some of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military technology, was becoming increasingly desperate to make contact. For more than a year, Adolf Tolkachev repeatedly attempted to volunteer his services to American intelligence and was repeatedly rebuffed. The psychological toll of these failed attempts must have been considerable. Each approach represented an enormous risk. Each rejection meant that the risk had been taken for nothing. Each rejection increased the possibility that eventually, through sheer statistical probability, one of his approaches would be observed by KGB surveillance teams that regularly monitored American diplomats in Moscow. The envelope Tolkachev placed in the diplomat's mailbox on January 13, 1978, contained a handwritten letter in Russian, 3 pages long, along with several pages of technical documents. The letter identified Tolkachev by name, provided his home address and telephone number, described his position at Phazotron, and listed the types of classified materials he had access to. The letter expressed his desire to work with American intelligence against the Soviet system. It explained his motivations in terms that combined ideological opposition to Soviet communism with personal grievances related to his wife's family history. The letter also included a warning. He understood the risks, he accepted them, and he wanted the Americans to understand that he was serious and that his access to classified materials was genuine. The technical documents included in the envelope were page photographs from classified Soviet military research reports describing radar signal processing algorithms. According to CIA technical analysts who reviewed these documents, they represented genuine classified Soviet military research, and they demonstrated that the writer had access to highly sensitive programs. The diplomat whose mailbox Tolkachev had used was indeed a CIA case officer, though his actual identity remains classified even in declassified CIA historical accounts. For purposes of this account, CIA documents refer to him by the pseudonym John Gilsher. Gilsher discovered the envelope on the evening of January 14th, when he returned home from work. He brought it to the CIA station at the American Embassy, where it was reviewed by the station chief and senior case officers. The assessment this time was different. The level of detail in the letter, the inclusion of genuine classified technical documents as proof of access, and the fact that the volunteer had provided his actual name and contact information suggested this was not a KGB provocation. Provocations typically involved vague offers, refused to provide identifying information, and avoided including genuine classified materials that could themselves be viewed as security breaches by Soviet authorities. The CIA station chief authorized a response. On February 3, 1978, a CIA officer returned to the residential building where Tolkachev lived and placed a response letter in Tolkachev's mailbox. The letter, written in Russian, acknowledged receipt of his approach, expressed interest in establishing contact, and proposed a meeting location and time. The letter also included instructions for counter-surveillance procedures Tolkachev should follow to determine whether he was under KGB observation before attending the meeting. The proposed meeting was scheduled for February 16, 1978, at 7:30 p.m., at a specific location in a forested park in northeastern Moscow. The exact location name has been altered in declassified documents for security purposes. Tolkachev was instructed to walk along a particular path at the designated time. If conditions were suitable, meaning he had not detected surveillance and the CIA officer had not detected surveillance, contact would be made. If either party detected surveillance, the meeting would be aborted and an alternate date would be used. On the evening of February 16th, Adolf Tolkachev left his apartment and took a circuitous route involving multiple bus and metro transfers designed to detect or evade any surveillance. He arrived at the designated park and began walking along the specified path. The weather was cold and overcast, typical for February in Moscow, and few other people were in the park. Their breath formed clouds in the frozen air. At approximately 7:35 p.m., a man approached Tolkachev from the opposite direction, made brief eye contact, and said in Russian, _0, this was the prearranged recognition signal. Tolkachev responded with the countersign, _1. The man introduced himself using a Russian name, almost certainly an alias, and suggested they walk together. Tolkachev's hands shook as they began walking, whether from cold or nerves. The CIA officer couldn't tell. They spent approximately 30 minutes walking along the park's paths while conducting an initial conversation that would mark the beginning of one of the CIA's most productive Cold War intelligence operations. During this first meeting, Tolkachev provided additional details about his position at Phazotron, the types of projects he worked on, and the materials he had access to. He reiterated his motivations and his willingness to accept the risks of espionage. The CIA officer, who according to agency records was likely John Gilsher, assessed Tolkachev's demeanor as calm, determined, and fully aware of the gravity of what he was proposing. They agreed to meet again in 2 weeks at a different location. Over the following months, from February through June 1978, Tolkachev and his CIA handler established a working relationship. Meetings were held approximately every 2 to 3 weeks at various locations around Moscow: parks, cultural sites, residential neighborhoods. Communication between meetings was conducted through dead drops, concealed locations where Tolkachev could leave materials for CIA officers to retrieve, or where CIA officers could leave instructions or payments for Tolkachev to collect. These dead drops were hidden in locations like park benches, cemetery monuments, building entryways, and wooded areas. The materials Tolkachev provided during these early months were extraordinarily valuable. He photographed technical documents, research reports, design specifications, and test results for Soviet radar systems. He provided information about Soviet aviation research programs, including specifications for new fighter aircraft being developed. He provided details about Soviet military planning, operational procedures, and organizational structures. During one meeting in the summer of 1979, Tolkachev arrived with film containing photographs of the complete technical manual for an upgraded Sapphire radar system. 1,247 pages photographed over 3 weeks of work. CIA technical analysts reviewing these materials assessed them as genuine, current, and highly classified. The information Tolkachev was providing represented years of Soviet research and development work in fields critical to military effectiveness. In June 1978, the CIA provided Tolkachev with a Truppel camera, a sophisticated miniature camera designed for covertly photographing documents. The camera was small enough to be concealed in a pocket and could photograph documents quickly with minimal setup. CIA officers trained Tolkachev in its use during meetings in Moscow. Tolkachev proved to be meticulous in his photographic work, producing clear, well-focused images even when working under difficult conditions. Tolkachev's tradecraft, the operational security measures he followed to avoid detection, was generally good, though not perfect. He understood the importance of varying his routes, checking for surveillance, and maintaining the appearance of a normal life. However, he also took risks that concerned his CIA handlers. He sometimes photographed documents at work, hiding in bathroom stalls or storage rooms to use his camera. He transported classified materials out of the Phazotron facility, which violated security regulations and created risk if he were searched. He stored photographed film in his apartment where it could be discovered if Soviet security services decided to conduct a search. CIA officers attempted to counsel Tolkachev to take fewer risks and to follow stricter security procedures. Tolkachev's response, according to meeting reports, was that he wanted to provide as much information as possible while he still could. He seemed to operate with an assumption that eventually he would be caught, and that his goal was to maximize his contribution before that happened. The CIA paid Tolkachev approximately $5,000 to $10,000 per delivery of materials, depending on the volume and assessed value of the information. Over the course of his cooperation, Tolkachev would receive more than $100,000. This money was paid in cash, US dollars, which Tolkachev kept hidden in his apartment. He could not spend significant amounts without attracting attention, as sudden unexplained wealth would trigger suspicion from neighbors, colleagues, and security services. His plan, according to statements he made to his handlers, was to accumulate enough money to facilitate his son Oleg's eventual emigration from the Soviet Union, perhaps through bribery of officials or through establishment of resources outside the country. By the end of 1978, Adolf Tolkachev had been working as a CIA asset for approximately 10 months. During that time, he had provided thousands of pages of photographed documents covering Soviet radar technology, aviation research, and military planning. CIA assessments described him as the most valuable technical intelligence source the agency had recruited in the Soviet Union in decades. The information Tolkachev provided had immediate practical value for American military planning. Between 1978 and 1985, he photographed more than 20,000 pages of classified Soviet documents. These materials included complete technical specifications for the RP-23 Sapphire radar used in MiG-23 fighters, the N-019 Sapphire-29 radar for the new MiG-29, and the developmental SBI-16 Zaslon phased array radar intended for the MiG-31 interceptor. Soviet radar systems represented one of the most significant challenges for U.S. military aviation. During the Cold War, any potential conflict between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces would involve massive air operations, and the effectiveness of those operations would depend heavily on the ability of American aircraft to penetrate Soviet air defenses. This intelligence allowed American engineers to understand not just what Soviet radars could detect, but how they detected it, the signal processing algorithms, frequency hopping patterns, and filtering techniques that determined radar performance. Understanding these technical details meant American electronic warfare specialists could develop countermeasures specifically tailored to Soviet systems. It meant American stealth aircraft designers could validate their radar cross-section reduction techniques against actual Soviet detection capabilities rather than theoretical models. For example, Tolkachev provided detailed specifications for the radar system used in the Soviet MiG-29 fighter aircraft, which was being developed during the late 1970s. According to CIA technical assessments, the Sapphire-29 radar could track up to 10 targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers, capabilities American planners had underestimated. This information allowed American engineers to understand the MiG-29's detection capabilities, tracking ranges, and vulnerabilities. It informed the development of American electronic countermeasures and tactics for air-to-air combat. According to declassified CIA assessments, the information Tolkachev provided about the MiG-29 radar alone saved the United States well over $1 billion in research costs, the estimated price of developing equivalent radar technology from scratch. Defense Department officials calculated that the intelligence provided advantages in air combat that could mean the difference between American air superiority and contested airspace in any NATO Warsaw Pact conflict. Tolkachev also provided information about Soviet research into stealth technology and radar cross-section reduction. During the late 1970s, the United States was in the early stages of developing stealth aircraft, most notably the F-117 Nighthawk, which would eventually become operational in the early 1980s. Understanding what Soviet radar systems could and could not detect was critical for designing aircraft that could evade detection. Tolkachev's information helped American engineers validate their assumptions about stealth technology and confirm that their approaches would be effective against Soviet detection systems. Throughout 1979 and 1980, Tolkachev continued to meet regularly with CIA handlers and to provide classified materials. The operational pattern remained consistent: meetings every 2 to 3 weeks, communications through dead drops, photography of documents at Phazotron or sometimes at his home, delivery of film to CIA officers. Tolkachev's life maintained its outward appearance of normality. He went to work, spent time with his family, participated in ordinary social activities. His wife, Natasha, appeared to have no knowledge of his espionage activities. His son, Oleg, who was in his early 20s by this time, also appeared to be unaware. However, the strain of living a double life was evident in Tolkachev's behavior during meetings with CIA handlers. According to meeting reports, he often appeared tense, tired, and sometimes frustrated. He expressed concern about how much longer he could continue without being caught. He worried about his family's fate if he were arrested. He asked his handlers whether the CIA could arrange for his family to be evacuated from the Soviet Union if he came under suspicion. The CIA explored various options for exfiltration, removing Tolkachev and his family from the Soviet Union if his security was compromised. These options included diplomatic evacuation, clandestine border crossing using forged documents and disguises, and third-country transit through legitimate travel with planned defection. However, all of these options presented significant operational challenges and risks. Soviet border security was extensive and sophisticated. Tolkachev's travel outside the Soviet Union was restricted due to his security clearances. Any sudden disappearance of Tolkachev and his family would trigger immediate investigation and pursuit. In 1981, Tolkachev's intelligence production reached its peak. During that year alone, he provided more than 10,000 pages of photographed documents. The materials covered an extraordinary range of Soviet military research programs, including information about new air-to-air missiles, radar warning systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and aviation electronics. CIA technical analysts working at the agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, struggled to keep pace with the volume of material Tolkachev was producing. The value of Tolkachev's intelligence was recognized at the highest levels of the U.S. government. According to declassified documents, intelligence reports based on Tolkachev's information were regularly briefed to the President's daily brief. The classified intelligence summary prepared each day for the President of the United States. Senior military officials at the Department of Defense received regular updates on Tolkachev's reporting and used the information to inform decisions about weapons development, force structure, and operational planning. In 1982, the CIA made the decision to change handlers for Tolkachev. John Gilshare, who had been serving as Tolkachev's primary handler since the beginning of the operation, was scheduled to complete his tour of duty at the American Embassy and return to the United States. A new case officer, referred to in CIA documents by the pseudonym David Rolfe, was assigned to take over the relationship with Tolkachev. The transition to a new handler created additional risk. Tolkachev had to be introduced to a new CIA officer, which required a meeting where both the new handler and Tolkachev would be present and potentially vulnerable to surveillance. The new handler had to establish trust and rapport with Tolkachev, which took time and multiple meetings. During this transition period, the operational tempo was reduced to minimize risk. The handover meetings between Gilsher, Rolfe, and Tolkachev occurred over several weeks in early 1982. According to CIA records, Tolkachev adapted to the new handler but expressed regret about the change. He had developed a working relationship with Gilsher over 4 years and felt comfortable with him. The relationship with Rolfe would need to be rebuilt. Throughout 1982 and 1983, Tolkachev continued to provide intelligence at a reduced pace. Despite his promotion at Phazotron to a position with even greater access, he expressed increasing anxiety about security. During meetings with Rolfe, Tolkachev mentioned noticing unusual interest from security officers at Phazotron. He described being asked questions about his work habits, his social contacts, and his activities outside work. These questions may have been routine security reviews, or they may have indicated early suspicions. In 1984, the CIA learned through a separate intelligence source that KGB counterintelligence had intensified its investigation of potential intelligence leaks from Soviet defense research institutes. The source indicated that the KGB believed American intelligence had obtained detailed information about Soviet radar systems and was attempting to identify the leak. This information was passed to Tolkachev during a meeting, and he was advised to consider whether he wanted to stop providing intelligence and focus on protecting himself and his family. Tolkachev's response was that he wanted to continue. According to the meeting report, he stated that if he stopped now, everything he had risked would have less meaning. He believed the information he was providing was important and that he should continue as long as possible. This decision troubled his CIA handlers, who recognized he was operating in an environment of heightened KGB attention. What neither Tolkachev nor his CIA handlers knew at the time was that Tolkachev's security had already been compromised through a completely separate channel that had nothing to do with his operational security or KGB surveillance in Moscow. The compromise had originated in Washington, D.C., and involved a CIA officer who had turned traitor. Edward Lee Howard had been a CIA case officer who had been trained to work on Soviet operations and had been scheduled for assignment to the CIA station in Moscow. During his training, Howard had been briefed on CIA operations in Moscow, including information about Adolf Tolkachev. In 1983, before Howard could be deployed to Moscow, CIA security officials discovered that Howard had been deceptive during polygraph examinations about drug use and petty theft. His security clearance was revoked, and he was dismissed from the CIA. Howard, angry about his dismissal and facing financial difficulties, made contact with Soviet intelligence in 1984 and offered to provide information about CIA operations. He met with KGB officers and provided details about CIA tradecraft, operational procedures, and specific operations in Moscow. The information he provided included the existence of a highly valuable CIA asset working at a Soviet defense research facility. Howard did not know Tolkachev's name, but he provided enough information about the operation, the types of meetings, the locations of dead drops, the general profile of the asset, that KGB counterintelligence could begin narrowing their investigation. At the same time, another source of compromise was developing. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer working in the agency's Soviet counterintelligence division, had also decided to commit espionage. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to provide the KGB with the names of Soviet citizens working as American intelligence assets. In exchange, he wanted substantial financial payment. Over the following months, Ames provided the KGB with a list of more than 10 Soviet assets, including Adolf Tolkachev. Ames was not acting out of ideological conviction or personal grievance, but simply for money. He sold the names of Soviet assets to the KGB for approximately $2.7 million paid over nearly a decade. Each name on the list he provided represented a human being who would be arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Ames knew this and did it anyway because he wanted money to support an expensive lifestyle. The KGB now had confirmation from two separate sources that there was a CIA asset at a Soviet defense research facility, and from Ames they had Tolkachev's name. KGB counterintelligence placed Tolkachev under intensive surveillance. His apartment was searched when he was at work. His telephone was tapped. Surveillance teams followed him during his daily routines. KGB technical specialists examined documents at Phazotron for evidence of unauthorized photography. On the morning of June 9, 1985, Adolf Tolkachev was arrested at his apartment. According to accounts later provided by Soviet sources, KGB officers arrived at approximately 6 a.m. before sunrise on the short summer night. Neighbors later reported hearing heavy footsteps in the stairwell, then pounding on the Tolkachev apartment door. 3 black Volga sedans were parked on the street below, engines running. The KGB officers presented an arrest warrant charging Tolkachev with espionage and treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The search of the apartment was methodical and destructive. Officers pulled books from shelves, emptied drawers onto the floor, rolled back carpets, and removed electrical outlet covers. In the bedroom closet, wrapped in old newspapers and hidden inside a boot, they found the trapel camera the CIA had provided. In the kitchen, taped to the underside of a drawer, they found approximately $8,000 in U.S. currency. In the small study where Tolkachev worked in the evenings, they found exposed film containing photographs of classified documents and handwritten notes in Tolkachev's precise engineering script outlining technical specifications he planned to photograph. Natasha Tolkachev stood in the hallway in her nightgown and robe, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe. According to neighbors who heard the commotion, she kept repeating there must be a mistake as officers moved through the apartment. Oleg, awakened by the noise, emerged from his bedroom and tried to speak to his father. A KGB officer pushed him back, ordering him to remain in his room. Adolf Tolkachev himself, according to KGB reports filed later that morning, appeared resigned. He offered no resistance. He did not deny the charges. His first statement, made as officers prepared to take him to Lefortovo prison, was directed to his wife. "Natasha, I am sorry. They will not punish you or Oleg. I made them promise." It was a promise the KGB had no authority to make and no intention of keeping. Tolkachev was transported to Lefortovo prison, the KGB's primary detention facility for political prisoners and accused spies. The facility, located in eastern Moscow, was notorious for harsh conditions and intensive interrogation procedures. Tolkachev was placed in solitary confinement and began what would become months of interrogation. During interrogations, Tolkachev initially attempted to minimize the extent of his espionage activities and to protect his family by claiming he had acted alone without their knowledge. However, as interrogators confronted him with the evidence found in his apartment, the camera, the cash, the photographs, he eventually acknowledged the full scope of his cooperation with the CIA. According to later accounts, he provided detailed information about his meetings with CIA officers, the locations of dead drops, and the methods he had used to photograph documents. Tolkachev's interrogators were particularly interested in understanding how he had maintained his espionage activities for so long without detection. According to declassified KGB documents, Tolkachev explained his operational security procedures, his counter-surveillance techniques, and his careful maintenance of his outward appearance as a loyal Soviet engineer. The interrogators concluded that Tolkachev had been operationally sophisticated and that his detection had required specific intelligence from compromised CIA officers rather than routine counterintelligence work. Natasha Tolkachev was also interrogated, though she was not arrested or charged with any crime. KGB investigators concluded that she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities. According to later accounts, she expressed complete shock and disbelief when informed of what her husband had done. She insisted that he had been a good husband and father, that he had never expressed anti-Soviet views in her presence, and that she could not understand how he could have done such a thing. Oleg Tolkachev, like his mother, was interrogated but not charged. He also had no knowledge of his father's activities. According to accounts from neighbors and acquaintances interviewed by Soviet security services, Oleg defended his father initially, arguing that there must have been a mistake or that his father had been coerced. However, as the KGB confronted him with evidence of Adolf's guilt, Oleg became withdrawn and stopped discussing his father. Adolf Tolkachev's trial was held in Moscow City Court in September 1986. The proceedings were closed to the public due to the classified nature of the evidence. Tolkachev was represented by a state-appointed defense attorney who made minimal effort to challenge the prosecution's case. The evidence against Tolkachev was overwhelming. The materials found in his apartment, his own confessions during interrogation, testimony from security officials at Phazotron, and photographic evidence of his meetings with CIA officers that KGB surveillance teams had documented after placing him under observation. Tolkachev was convicted of high treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The verdict described him as having betrayed the motherland by providing critical military secrets to a hostile foreign power over a period of 7 years. The sentence, as required by Soviet law for treason, was death by execution. On September 24, 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was executed by firing squad at Butyrka prison in Moscow. He was 59 years old. According to Soviet procedures, his family was not informed of the execution until after it had been carried out. They were notified by official letter several weeks later, informing them that the sentence had been implemented and that his body would not be returned to them. The impact on Tolkachev's family was profound and immediate. According to accounts from former neighbors interviewed by researchers in the 1990s, Natasha was dismissed from her translation job. She faced social ostracism from neighbors and former friends. Neighbors stopped buying groceries at the same market she used. When she entered a shop, conversations would stop, and people would turn away. In Soviet society, the families of convicted traitors were often treated as pariahs, subject to suspicion and discrimination. Natasha struggled with depression and with practical difficulties related to loss of income and social support. She never remarried and lived quietly in Moscow for the remainder of her life. She declined all requests for interviews about her former husband's case and refused to discuss the matter with anyone outside her immediate family. Oleg Tolkachev faced even greater difficulties. According to available accounts, he was expelled from the university he was attending. His professional prospects were destroyed. No Soviet institution would hire the son of a convicted traitor to work in any position requiring trust or responsibility. He faced hostility from peers and acquaintances. According to later accounts from people who knew the family, Oleg became bitter and angry, unable to reconcile his memories of his father with the crimes his father had been convicted of. He eventually found work in a low-level technical position, but never recovered his professional prospects or his sense of identity. According to people who knew him in later years, he remained deeply conflicted about his father, simultaneously proud that his father had stood against the Soviet system and angry that his father's choices had destroyed their family's life. The Tolkachev case caused significant damage to CIA operations in Moscow. In addition to losing one of the agency's most valuable assets, the CIA had to assume that other operations in Moscow might have been compromised. Meetings were canceled, dead drops were abandoned, and case officers were withdrawn from Moscow on the assumption that their identities might have been provided to the KGB by Tolkachev under interrogation. The CIA station in Moscow essentially shut down active operations for more than a year while conducting damage assessment and reviewing security procedures. The investigation into how Tolkachev had been compromised focused initially on operational security failures, whether CIA case officers had been observed during meetings, whether dead drops had been detected, whether Tolkachev's tradecraft had been inadequate. However, by late 1985, the CIA had begun to suspect that the compromise might have originated from within the agency itself. The fact that Tolkachev and several other Soviet assets had been arrested within a short period suggested a systematic betrayal rather than random operational failures. The investigation eventually identified Edward Lee Howard and Aldrich Ames as the sources of compromise. Howard had defected to the Soviet Union in September 1985, just months after providing information to the KGB and shortly before Tolkachev's arrest. His defection made his betrayal obvious. Ames, however, continued working at the CIA and was not identified as a traitor until 1994, after nearly a decade of providing classified information to Soviet and then Russian intelligence. The damage caused by Howard and Ames extended far beyond the Tolkachev case. Between them, they compromised dozens of CIA and FBI operations, led to the arrest and execution of at least 10 Soviet citizens working as American intelligence assets, and provided the KGB with detailed information about American intelligence methods, priorities, and capabilities. The betrayals represented one of the most significant counterintelligence failures in CIA history. The system that allowed Howard and Ames to betray intelligence operations was itself flawed. The CIA's counterintelligence procedures in the 1980s proved inadequate to detect officers who were committing espionage. Security reviews were insufficiently rigorous. Polygraph examinations were not frequent enough or sophisticated enough to catch deception. Financial monitoring of CIA officers was inadequate to detect unexplained wealth. The agency's culture emphasized operational success over security, and this emphasis created vulnerabilities that Soviet intelligence exploited. After the betrayals were discovered and investigated in the 1990s, the CIA implemented significant reforms to its security and counterintelligence procedures. For the CIA officers who had worked with Tolkachev, his arrest and execution were both professionally devastating and personally traumatic. John Gilsher, who had served as Tolkachev's handler for the first 4 years of the operation, learned of the arrest while working at CIA headquarters. According to later accounts from colleagues, Gilsher was deeply affected by the news, expressing guilt about whether there had been operational security failures he should have detected and anger toward whoever had betrayed Tolkachev to Soviet intelligence. David Rolfe, who had taken over as Tolkachev's handler in 1982, had been in Moscow when Tolkachev was arrested. The CIA station learned of the arrest through its own surveillance of Soviet security activities and through reports from other assets. Rolf was immediately withdrawn from Moscow and reassigned to CIA headquarters. According to later accounts, he struggled with feelings of responsibility for Tolkachev's fate, even though the compromise had originated from betrayals in Washington rather than from anything Rolf had done or failed to do in Moscow. The intelligence community's assessment of Tolkachev's contribution was unanimous. He had been one of the most valuable assets of the Cold War era. CIA Director William Casey later wrote that Tolkachev had been the most productive asset the CIA ever had in the Soviet Union. According to declassified assessments, his intelligence was conservatively estimated at billions of dollars in research costs saved and strategic advantages that fundamentally changed American understanding of Soviet capabilities. However, this strategic value came at an extraordinary human cost. Adolf Tolkachev paid with his life. His wife, Natasha, lived the remainder of her life as the widow of a traitor, facing social stigma and economic hardship. Oleg Tolkachev struggled for years with the consequences of his father's actions. According to people who knew him in later years, he remained deeply conflicted about his father, simultaneously proud that his father had stood against the Soviet system and angry that his father's choices had destroyed their family's life. The Tolkachev case raises profound questions about the ethics and human costs of espionage. From an American strategic perspective, recruiting and running Tolkachev was unambiguously successful. The information advanced national security interests and potentially prevented Soviet military advantages with serious consequences. From Tolkachev's perspective, his actions stemmed from genuine ideological conviction and desire to damage a system he viewed as evil. He volunteered knowing the risks, maintained his espionage for 7 years, and achieved what he saw as his purpose: inflicting damage on the Soviet military-industrial complex and contributing to what he hoped would be the eventual defeat of Soviet communism. But from his family's perspective, the situation appears entirely different. Natasha and Oleg loved Adolf as husband and father, had no knowledge of his activities and no opportunity to influence his decisions. When he was arrested, their lives were destroyed through no fault of their own. They lost him to execution, lost their social standing and economic security, and became victims of a decision they never made and could not understand or accept. The question of whether Adolf Tolkachev had the right to make this choice, to commit espionage, knowing that if caught, his family would suffer severe consequences, has no clear answer. Individuals must be able to act according to their convictions, even when those actions carry personal risk. Yet, his choice imposed enormous costs on people who had no say in it. Natasha had not chosen to marry a spy. Oleg had not chosen to be the son of a traitor. The CIA's role in this moral complexity is also ambiguous. The agency recruited and ran Tolkachev because he provided valuable intelligence that advanced American national security. CIA officers followed established procedures, maintained operational security to the best of their ability, and attempted to protect Tolkachev from detection. They offered him opportunities to stop if he felt the risks were too great. In these ways, the CIA acted professionally and responsibly within the framework of intelligence operations. However, the CIA also benefited from Tolkachev's willingness to take risks that the agency itself did not have to bear. When Tolkachev was eventually caught and executed, CIA officers faced professional consequences and personal anguish, but they were not executed. They were not imprisoned. Their families were not destroyed. The asymmetry of risk where the asset bears almost all the danger while the handling agency receives almost all the benefit, raises ethical questions about the morality of espionage recruitment, regardless of how professionally it is conducted. The ultimate assessment of the Tolkachev case depends on which perspective one adopts. From the perspective of Cold War strategic competition, the operation was a significant success that provided critical intelligence and advanced American national security. From the perspective of intelligence tradecraft, the operation demonstrated both excellent recruitment and handling and catastrophic security failures. From the perspective of individual morality, the case presents a tangle of conflicting responsibilities, impossible choices, and tragic consequences. Whether Tolkachev's espionage actually affected any specific military or strategic outcomes is impossible to determine with certainty. Intelligence operations, by their nature, involve the accumulation of many small pieces of information that are assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. What is certain is the human cost, not just to Tolkachev himself, but to his family. Natasha Tolkachev spent decades dealing with the aftermath of her husband's choices, including the financial hardship, the social stigma, and the challenge of living as the widow of a convicted traitor in Soviet society. Oleg Tolkachev grew up in the shadow of his father's crimes, dealing with shame, confusion, and the loss of a parent not to death, but to imprisonment and disgrace, followed by execution. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who were operating within systems and circumstances that shaped their choices. Adolf Tolkachev chose to commit espionage, and he bore responsibility for that choice and its consequences. But he made that choice within a Cold War context that encouraged ideological polarization, that treated classified information as currency in a global competition, and that created opportunities and incentives for espionage. The KGB officers who recruited and handled Soviet intelligence operations were operating within a system that valued intelligence collection and that treated human assets as tools to be exploited. The CIA officers who investigated and ran Tolkachev were operating within a system that prioritized national security and that granted broad authorities for recruitment and intelligence gathering. All of these individuals were, to varying degrees, acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited, and all of them contributed to outcomes that harmed people who had little or no agency in the situation. Natasha Tolkachev, Oleg Tolkachev, and many others whose lives were disrupted by the case. Adolf Tolkachev was 50 years old when he first placed an envelope in an American diplomat's mailbox on a Moscow street in 1978. He was 59 when he was executed in a Moscow prison in 1986. In between, he provided intelligence that may have influenced the outcome of the Cold War. He risked his life repeatedly for convictions he believed in, and he made a choice that would destroy his family. Whether that choice was heroic or selfish, justified or unjustifiable, depends on whether one values ideological conviction and strategic advantage more than family loyalty and the protection of innocent people from the consequences of others' decisions. The documents Tolkachev photographed are now declassified and stored in archives. The radar systems he provided information about are obsolete, replaced by technologies that did not exist in the 1980s. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the ideological conflict that motivated Tolkachev's espionage is now history. What remains is the human story. A man who made an impossible choice, a family destroyed by consequences they did not deserve, and the enduring question of what responsibility we bear for the choices we make when those choices impose costs on others.